Adam, this new war with Iran seems to intensify with each day. So my question to you is, how did we get here?
We've asked this question before explicitly in the intro and then also every episode, but it coming up now means only one thing. It's time for a history episode!
Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we look at protests and revolutions, past and present, perhaps so we're not too surprised if one actually happens right in front of us. I'm Sam, and joining me, as always, is my spiritual brother in the UK who knows all too well that the only just war is a class war. Adam, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Sam. Thank you for asking. It's a sunny day. I came here from a protest in central Bristol, small one, but energetic, and I'm excited to be going into this topic with you today. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I just woke up not too long ago, thus the raspiness of my voice. But I believe this is one of the first times we're recording while the sun is out for both of us.
Yeah, it's a rare occurrence for sure.
Life here is getting interesting because oil prices have skyrocketed due to the events we just spoke about last time. And that can only mean one thing. It means that conservatives actually feel something because it's affected their wallets. So there's a lot of talk, a lot of political talk as gas goes above $6 a gallon in California. I know that gas is getting very expensive around the world in general because of this conflict, even for countries not involved. But speaking of that, You're correct. We are going to be having a history episode today, part 1 of Iran's history, and maybe we can figure out how we got in this situation, because as so many of our politicians seem to tell us, it was inevitable. But let's see how true that statement actually is. But before we start with the history lesson, Adam, can you give us some updates on what's happened with Iran and the US in the past roughly 2 weeks since we recorded?
Yeah, so there have been 1,400 plus confirmed deaths in Iran due to American-Israeli strikes. Of those, at least 204 are children. More than 1,000 people have been killed in Lebanon due to Israeli strikes in the country, and there are evacuation orders in place in Beirut. The new supreme leader, I don't remember if this had happened when we recorded the last episode, but Mojtaba Khomeini, the son of the previous Ayatollah, has been named the supreme leader. Iran managed to destroy an F-35 fighter jet using a drone. That is a $1 trillion defense project that is now apparently no longer guaranteeing American air supremacy in the area. Trump has thrown a tantrum because other world leaders are refusing to support him in attempting to force open the Strait of Hormuz, which the closure of which is responsible for gas prices getting so high, as you say. Keir Starmer, the spineless Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, has indeed allowed Trump to launch airstrikes from British naval bases, and in return, Iran has struck the Diego Garcia Islands, where there is a military base. I believe it's a British base that is leased to America, so it is American military infrastructure that's there, even though it's a British territory, technically. And strikes have continued across the region. American interests in Qatar and the UAE and Kuwait and Iraq have been struck. I believe 60 Americans have been killed at this point. But that we don't appear any closer to a resolution. Though I will say, throughout all of this, there have been reports of celebrations in Iran, both for Eid al-Fitr, which was yesterday, the end of Ramadan, and also for Persian New Year, which is called Nowruz. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but Nowruz is how it's spelt. And that was also yesterday and involves jumping over a fire. It's kind of a Zoroastrian tradition. It's fun. And a lot of those gatherings turned into anti-Western protests, reportedly, throughout the country as well.
I mean, as Gaza has proven, celebrations can't be hindered by bombs falling, right? We always see celebrations around Ramadan as well there. And I'm sure that between now and recording our part 2 of this episode, there will be some more changes. But as you said, $1 trillion project for the F-35s. Americans, just remember that number when they say we can't have high-speed rail or universal health care. we get cuts to our libraries, cuts to our public broadcasting.
Student loan forgiveness.
Can't have student loan forgiveness. That would be unconstitutional, Adam.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wanted to get that update about what's going on now because, as you mentioned, stuff going on in Lebanon and between Lebanon and Israel in relation to this. And when events like that happen, I think we need to zoom out and be like, how did we get here? Why is Lebanon involved? What do they have to do with Iran? Why does Israel hate Iran so much to where they started all of this? Well, that's what we'll find out today. The answer is always in history. And last episode, we talked about what's going on today. We talked about schools being hit, the oil prices spiking, protests around the globe. But for many listeners, the question might be, why? Why is this happening? Why does the U.S. hate Iran so much? Why does Iran hate the West, and specifically Israel and America, apart from the obvious bombs falling? Today, we're going to be doing a crash course in modern Iranian history. And the best way to demystify propaganda against an enemy, quote unquote, is to know more about them and to learn the other side of the story that the Western news or your Western history classes may not be telling you. Though this is not a PhD seminar, we're not going to get too deep into the weeds here. We definitely could, there's enough information, but we will be covering Iranian history, which is beefy enough in a general sense. So through that, we're going to look at how this, 2,500-year-old civilization became the enemy, quote unquote, to the West, and why this current war might be one of the dumbest military decisions in 80 years, and it will be heavily oversimplified. And thus, I don't have a ton of specific sources since most of this information is pretty general history, but one book I would recommend to draw upon for any topic in the Middle East is A History of the Modern Middle East by William L. Cleveland and Martin Bunton. This book was kind of like my go-to encyclopedia for various courses during my undergrad, and it's a very good general history of the Middle East. So if you are looking to read more about the region, I would recommend that book. It is a history, not a textbook, but it's a deep dive in history, so be prepared for that. But I would recommend it. This will be 2 parts because we want to keep this right around an hour each, or hopefully under. Now, I have a question for you, Adam, before we start. Mm-hmm. When you hear the word Iran, what comes to mind? And maybe that is different for you than the general British person or American. And specifically, what do you think non-lefty anthropologists picture in their heads when they hear Iran?
You're probably right. I think that what most people think of when they hear Iran in the UK or maybe US is the sort of repressive regime that adheres to a sort of strict form of Islamic morality. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the supreme leader, the Ayatollahs, and fairly oppressive policies there, I think is what comes to most people's minds. I have a more nuanced view of Iran than that, and one thing I do think of in particular is what a beautiful country it is supposed to be. I would love to get the opportunity to go one day. Tehran is a beautiful looking city surrounded by mountains on all sides. I understand that they have some pretty interesting economics that have developed in response to sanctions that have been placed on them by the United States. In particular, the fact that whilst Iranians can invest, they can only invest in Iranian companies, which has helped to build a surprisingly resilient economy to the sanctions they are placed under until recently. Oh, and I think that people will in general think of Iran's nuclear ambitions and their desire to build a nuclear, according to Iran, nuclear energy capabilities, according to Western powers, nuclear weapons capabilities.
I think most Westerners generally have an image of Iran that's no older than like 45 years old. They don't think pre-revolution, or if they do, they just think of the propaganda machine of the Pahlavi dynasty, where, they show like girls in bikinis and all that in Tehran, like in the 70s. But I think when history is taught, like in America, I don't know about the UK, I don't know about Switzerland, but when history is taught about the region, ancient Persia and modern Iran are completely separate in the same way that ancient Egypt and modern Egypt are completely separate. And
Yeah.
Persia is kind of treated as like this dead culture. But what we'll find out is that that's not really true at all. And there wasn't even the same history of a different linguistic group or people group coming in like in Egypt. This history and this culture is very alive and well. The religion changed at one point, but the language and the poetry traditions, and as you even said, like Persian New Year, that's all still going on. This is a very, very old culture.
One of the ways in which culture is often most sort of readily apparent, one of the first ways a lot of people encounter culture is through food and the kind of food that that different cultures prepare. And Iranian food, Persian food is really, really good. And I have fond memories of cooking with an Iranian diaspora friend, and she was invited over to my house for dinner, so I was cooking dinner, but she insisted that she took over when I was going to do the rice because she did not trust that I could prepare rice properly. And I was like, well, show me how. And she's like, okay, but I'm only doing the short way because that takes like an hour. The proper way takes a full day. I'm like, okay. And you know what? It was pretty good rice.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust you to make rice either.
I know how to make rice. I can make rice. This is fine.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I like to drop a stock cube in with the boiling water.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Vegan stock.
Yeah, vegan stock. Yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, and I think we're gonna see some of that beauty resonate when we look at the old foundation for the country we see today. But I think the most important part about this episode and why we tend to do some deep dives in history, even though they are not as popular as breaking news episodes, is because I think if you don't know this history, you can't understand why this war is such a catastrophic miscalculation. I don't think that the Trump administration knows this history. Let's dive into the background of the land, the language, the religion, empire, and the diversity of this region. Before there was Iran, it was Persia, one of the great ancient civilizations and continuously inhabited for thousands of years. And when we look at history, we got to look at the geography too, because that shapes everything. Modern Iran and ancient Persia sits on a massive plateau. It's at the crossroads of Asia, between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf. Mountain ranges, specifically the Zagros Mountains, surround a central desert in the country. And it's been a very strategic location for millennia. It's been the target of empires for just as long as well, as it's a crucial transit point for trade and one of the main players of the Silk Road. But it's a very unique geography. You know, when people talk about invading Afghanistan, this is like that times 10.
Right.
They speak Farsi, which is like the modern name for it, or potentially the old name. You'll have to correct me on that. But before that, in the West, it was just known as Persian. And it is an Indo-European language, which is completely different from Arabic, different roots, different everything about it, though the script became the same at one point. But the language itself is actually closer to English and German than it is to Arabic. And I think this is key in that Iranians are not Arabs, and that's where we have to start this discussion. That's a very key distinguishing point, and that's a key thing that people in the West either don't know or don't seem to care about. In Iran today, there's roughly 90 million people. It's ethnically diverse, and this is also important to understand because Persians, the dominant ethnic group, concentrated in the center of the country, only make up like 60 to 65% of the population. The next largest group is Azerbaijanis, who are Turkic-speaking, and they're concentrated in the northwest near the country of Azerbaijan. But they've played a pretty crucial role in modern Iran's political history. Many top leaders, including Supreme Leader Khamenei, have Azerbaijani heritage. So they haven't faced the same ostracization as some other groups. They're more in the fold. The next largest group are Kurds, which are roughly 7 to 10% of the country. As we mentioned last time, they have a history in the region as a whole and are present throughout several countries, not just in Iran. But they're concentrated on the Iraqi and Turkish borders. They're Sunni Muslim, so they're distinct from the general Shia Muslim in Iran. They have a distinct language, distinct culture, and this has led to some repression and separatist movements over the years. And actually, 3% of the country are Arabs in the southwest, in Khuzestan, where most of the oil is in Iran. This is very important because Iran is an oil-rich country, but it's very concentrated in this one part that does not have Persian people living in that region. And the last is the Baluch, which is around 2% of people which live in the southeast. They are also Sunni and live along the Pakistan border. There's other minorities as well: Turkmens, Armenians, Assyrians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, who see themselves as different culturally than the Shia majority.
It's interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned the Baluchs, because that was always something that stood out to me when you see the maps of suggested Balkanized versions of Iran. There is always a Baluchistan, and this was not a group I'd heard of before, and finding out that they represent only 2% of the population, and yet it always features on this Balkanized map. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, and that was a bit of a laundry list there of the different cultures there. But I mentioned it because of the topic of Balkanization, and that is one of the key goals of someone like Israel, is to Balkanize, which we defined last time. Mm-hmm. But in the region, you do have, all of its neighbors basically have co-ethnic populations. You know, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan. They're not one ethnic-centric country. So to do this on that basis just shows there's not really a foundation for it at all. Mm-hmm. And does that surprise you, Adam, how diverse Iran is? And how do you think a country with so many different groups holds together, especially when some of those groups, like Kurds and Arabs, have kin across borders?
Yeah, it's a good question. Does it surprise me? Not really. I knew Iran was a diverse place, as many countries are, of course, when you get down to it. What I did not know was that the Persians are a sort of distinct ethnic group. I thought that was a sort of linguistic change, where the country was known as Persia and is now known as Iran. But that makes sense that the Persians are a distinct group, and that's maybe why that happened. As for how they keep together, well, I think it depends country by country. There are presumably some things that link people in an Iranian identity, but many people have multifaceted identities. They have links that go across borders. They have ethnic identities that are outside of their dominant ethnic group. And I also suspect that part of what is a unifying feature of the sort of Iranian psyche that maybe hasn't held as strongly over the past year until the current bombardment is that Iran has sort of ended up being the sole anti-American state in the Middle East.
Yeah, especially with like the recent fall of Syria. We're going to jump very far back right now, briefly. We're going to talk some ancient history here, which we don't typically do because a lot of ancient cultures and decisions and everything don't typically affect today. Well, they do, but in a more macro level. But I think it's worth noting the Persian history because this is still very, very important to Iranians today. There's no separation between them and the figures of 2,500 years ago in the cultural memory of Iran. Now, before Islam, there was Zoroastrianism. This is an ancient monotheistic faith, the first monotheistic faith, according to a lot of people. It's an idea of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, and it's still practiced today, but just with a small minority of people. I know there are some groups that left the region and settled in India about 200 years ago that are also strong practitioners of this faith, but they left a very strong cultural imprint in Iranian culture and in monotheistic religions in general. The concepts of heaven, hell, final judgment, they influenced Judaism and Christianity later on. The first great empire, and really the first empire of the world, were the Achaemenid Persians. You probably have heard of Cyrus the Great. This was around 550 BCE. Cyrus is credited with first human rights charter, in a way, in his decrees across the empire, not forcing anyone to speak his language, not forcing anyone to take on his religion. He's known as freeing the Jews from Babylon. After that came the Sasanian Empire in the region from 224 to 651 AD, and this was the last pre-Islamic empire. but it had huge cultural influence, and it was constantly at war with Rome and the Byzantine Empire later. But in the 7th century, Islam arrives. This was through Arab conquests of the region. But here's the key. The Iranians converted but kept their culture. This was very, very different from how Islam spread in North Africa and out of the Arabian Peninsula and other places. So the Persians became Muslim but remained Persian. This pattern, adapting to foreign influences while preserving their identity, runs pretty deep through Iranian history. And then came the Sunni-Shia split. So after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, there was a dispute over succession. So the Shia comes from Shiat Ali, the party of Ali. They believed that leadership should stay in the Prophet's family, but the majority of Muslims became Sunni. The minority were the Shia. At this time, Persia, Iran was no different from the rest of the trends of the Islamic world.
Remind me, is Iran predominantly Shia or Sunni?
Today they are Shia. So jumping forward to 1501, the Safavid dynasty, they actually make 12er Shia Islam the state religion. This was a massive turning point. Because before, it was sort of a personal choice. Shia were kind of in the shadows throughout the Islamic world. Rulers would pop up here and there, but Sunni Islam was the dominant one. This was the first real empire that had Shia Islam as a state religion. Now, 12er Shias believe in the 12 divinely appointed imams, with the 12th being hidden, and they await his return. And this is like a messianic figure. They're always waiting for him to come back and liberate them. And the Shah of the Safavids in 1501 forcibly converted the majority Sunni Farsi-speaking population in modern Iran. And so Iran became the center of Shia Islam from that point forward. And this was a clear divide between the Ottoman Empire, which was next door, as they were Sunni.
And was that a sense to separate themselves from the Ottomans, or because the emperor thought that he could lay sort of claim to this 12th prophet position, or what's going on?
He was
there?
not trying to claim to be the 12th prophet, but he was a Shia himself. It was more to consolidate power with him, but there's also Shia around the region, so it was to create some legitimacy there as well. They sat in between two Sunni empires that the three of them make up what are known as the gunpowder empires. I don't know if you've heard this term.
I have not, no.
So the gunpowder empires were basically the first empires to utilize gunpowder in warfare. They were the most advanced civilizations in the world at the time. Maybe China had a point, but China was very isolationist at this stage. But that was the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal dynasty in northern India, who were also Muslim. But this is a divide that we still see today, right? Like Iran is still Shia, and somewhere like Saudi Arabia is Sunni. But today we still have Shia communities in Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain. They're actually a majority in some of those places. This is when religious identity became inseparable from Persian national identity. Like, to be Iranian is to be Shia for the most part, but to the Sunni minorities, the Kurds, the Baluchs, the Turkmens, this created a complicated relationship with the state because they did not convert.
One of the best books that I read during my master's was about an area of Southeast Asia called Zomia. And this is an area that historically passed between several different spheres of influence. They would be a part of one country officially, or no country officially, or even two countries officially, and just people would be like, oh yeah, I'm part of this country, depending on who happened to be walking through and carrying a big sword at the time. In part, that's because this was an area where people went to try and escape from state influence. But the reason I bring it up is that in the 15th century, the 16th century, before we have the modern technologies of state, it is important to remember that you probably could get away with paying lip service to a state more so than you could today. You could be like, oh yeah, I'm part of Persia, yeah, fine, and then just kind of live your life how you would want to anyway. In a lot of these places, it's not a thing that emerges spontaneously. It is something that must be maintained through technology, avenues of power, and other modes of control.
And that's very evident with Albanians in general. Their history cracks me up because, the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans, there were very hardline groups that were like, no, we are Catholic, we're Croatian Catholic, or we're Serbian Orthodox, and they fought back and were suppressed, and then you have to pay I forgot the name of the tax.
The zakat, the donation to charity.
There is a specific tax from the Ottomans where conquered peoples could keep their religion if they paid that extra tax.
Right. Yeah.
And the Serbs and the Croats, like, they refused to convert. They paid the extra tax. And Albanians were like, yeah, we'll convert. And they're like, what does that mean to be Muslim? And they're like, oh, you can't eat pork. You can't have alcohol. You have to do all this stuff. And they're like, yeah, cool. But if you've ever been to Albania or met Albanians, like, they just didn't change at all. Yeah. They just were like, what do you mean? We're Muslim. Like, we're not paying the tax. By the way, come to our barbecue. We're having pork and beer.
That's some great food in Albania.
But that falls directly under what you were saying of, like, it is hard to enforce that. And if people are paying lip service, you can't really punish them either,
Yeah.
But as time went on, these relationships with the state became a bit more complicated with the waning power of Persian influence in the region. The Qajars took power in 1796, and they ruled until 1925. They were like the last Persian dynasty until we get into the modern world. But they were very weak and corrupt political players, and they lost a lot of territory to Russia and Britain. There were territories that had been part of that influence for 1,000 years that became the Russian empires and then the Soviets and Soviet states later on. Places like Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, places like that. But I think it was important to run through this more ancient history because Iranians have a very long memory. Like, they remember being a world power when Europe was still tribal. They remember foreign domination as well. Like, every empire rolled through there at some point, but still the Persians survived. They remember that they are not Arabs, they are not Ottomans, and they are not Western. That is key for their identity as well. Though I do think some diaspora Persians do long for Western acceptance, potentially.
Yeah.
In the same way Israelis do too, right?
Yeah.
But when the U.S. says we'll remake the Middle East, Iranians have heard that before. They heard that from Alexander the Great. They heard it from Arabs. They heard it from the Mongols. They heard it from the British. But they're still here. So when a country has 2,500 years of continuous history, empires, poetry, philosophy, and then in the last 100 years is dominated by outside powers, how do you think that shapes how they see the world and their place in it?
I would imagine that it creates a pretty strong sense of patriotism.
And I'd imagine so as well.
Yeah, I think that it sounds like what you're setting up is that Iran is a country that has often been at the target of various interests and has managed to, as you say, retain its identity throughout being the center of this kind of geopolitical game across time, and that this sort of fierce independence, this national identity that is in part forged as part of being an outgroup, as part of being somewhere that is under threat, I imagine has a lasting influence.
I was doing my research for this episode, and as I was writing these points, I was like, this feels very familiar to our Chinese episode we did about their century of humiliation. Though I do think that while China had a century of that exploitation and attempts on its sovereignty in that way, its geography left it a bit more isolated in the past, whereas Iran is like the center of the world in terms of, if you look at it from a historical lens. So they have had that attempt on it for a long time by different powers, even before modern colonialism was a thing.
Yeah, because you had also the during the sort of age of empires in the 19th century, there was the notion of the Great Game, right, between Russia and Britain.
Well, my next section's titled.
Oh, okay. Is this the Russia-Britain squabble? Okay, then let's get to it.
Let's get into it. Nice segue. as you said, the Great Game, this is kind of the start of modern statescraft, right? And modern espionage and things like the CIA today, KGB, have its roots back in this time. In the 1800s, Iran was caught between two expanding empires. They had the Tsarist Russia to the north, and they had British India to the east. This was a bad time to be born anywhere in the world except in Europe, pretty much, or European empire, because the Europeans were carving up the world with their industrial power. There were two wars with Russia, 1804 to 1813, and then 1826 to 1828. And in these, Iran lost territory in the Caucasus, so modern Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. They were subject to some humiliating treaties, and this loss of territory still resonates. There's a famous Azeri poem about weeping for the lost gardens of the Caucasus Mountains. The British get involved to protect their interests in India, and this is the stage when Iran becomes a pawn in, quote-unquote, the Great Game. So what can you tell me about the Great Game, Adam?
Relatively little, but the Great Game, as I understand it, was a period of time in which Britain and Russia, Tsarist Russia, were focusing on the particularly resource-rich parts of their empires, which for Britain was India, and which for Russia was sort of Central Asia. And they knew that central to those interests, I believe in terms of access to trade routes, but also in terms of the sort of resource wealth of these places, Britain and the Russian Empire were constantly trying to undermine each other for supremacy in Iran and Afghanistan. And they played different groups against each other and funded different groups and supplied different weapons to different groups. It was all very modern in how it played out. But I know there's a very large book called The Return of a King, which is about the first Anglo-Afghan war in the 1880s and how they got protracted in this extended conflict in the Middle East, where they could not extract their soldiers from very easily. Again, stop me if you've heard this one before.
Yeah, absolutely. And during this time in the 1800s, Russia becomes the dominant military threat in the territory. They are sort of playing the old game at first, taking territory forcefully, coloring the map. But Britain becomes the dominant economic influence, and they aim for the trade routes and later oil. This pattern, two great powers squeezing Iran from north and south, continues later on, as we'll see. Much like they were doing in China, Britain didn't want to paint the map. They just wanted to control key ports, key resource points. They still did take territory, and this would shape the modern borders we see today in places like Iraq, Kuwait. Now, just wanted to mention the Kurds in this period. The Qajar state had weak control over its periphery, so Kurdish tribes in the west enjoyed semi-autonomy, playing the Ottoman and Persian authorities against each other during this point. I just want to check in with the Kurds every now and then because they're always a player. Now, the key material factor, because we are trying to look at this from a materialist viewpoint, was oil.
Okay.
In 1908, oil is discovered in southwestern Iran by a British subject, William Knox D'Arcy. This changes everything. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later named BP, is formed, and the British government buys a majority stake. And this is the first time a Western power directly owns another country's strategic resource. That's an asterisk because foreign governments owned whole countries. But
sure.
this is the first practice of recognizing sovereignty but owning a resource in that place.
Right. So kind of an early shift into the form of kind of economic imperialism that we see today.
100%. And the terms of this are brutal. Iran gets 16% of the profits, while Britain gets the rest. Iranian workers live in shanty towns. The British staff live in air-conditioned enclaves, which is a true fact because apparently air conditioning was invented in 1902.
Oh, wow.
These enclaves had their own clubs, swimming pools, hospitals, and this becomes the central grievance of the 20th century. It's Iran's oil, but it's Britain's profit, and every Iranian knows this story. Now, this was going on in Khuzestan, which is the Arab majority province, and it has a lot of divide and rule potential. because of the minority group, which is a majority there. In 1905, the Constitutional Revolution begins. This is a first attempt at democratic reform in Iran. Merchants, clerics, intellectuals unite to demand a constitution and a parliament. They call this the House of Justice. But Britain and Russia back the Qajar Shah against the reformers, and they send troops and threaten intervention. The revolution succeeds temporarily, but then it's crushed. The Shah orders the shelling of the parliament building with Russian-backed Cossack brigadiers, and this establishes another pattern. Every time Iranian people try to control their own destiny, outside powers intervene to stop it. Mm-hmm. Russia and Britain, despite being rivals, cooperate to keep Iran weak and divided. Checking in on the Kurds again. Some Kurds side with constitutionalists, hoping for more autonomy, and they're disappointed when the central government reasserts control. And right now we're talking 1908, like over a century ago, but the grievance over oil never went away. So do you see parallels with how resource extraction works today in the global south? And does that help explain why the West is such a loaded word in Iran?
I mean, for sure. When you talk about sort of Western, quote unquote, interests in, I guess, the developing world, we sort of don't really have great terminology for it, but we'll go with that for now. You often see today what are called like special economic zones. And these are areas where Western companies can set up and operate without really paying any tax. I have a good friend who spent a lot of time of work in Honduras and has and worked there. And this was a huge issue in previous elections, was they wanted the closure of these sort of special economic zones that are the historical successors to the United Fruit Company and Chiquita and the privileges that they had in there. And it also got me thinking about when I worked in cocoa, and when it comes to turning cocoa into chocolate, the most profitable part of that process, well, it's basically when you sort of initially process the cocoa bean and turn it into this kind of like into this paste. Exactly, it resembles chocolate. And this process used to be basically all done in the Netherlands or Switzerland or the UK. Now it's the Ivory Coast, and chocolate companies will say, look, this is now largely done in the Ivory Coast, but in the Ivory Coast, it is done in these special economic zones where the economic benefit to the country is a few dozen jobs. They don't pay any tax other than the income tax of those workers who are Ivorian, who work in these factories.
I mean, that just reminds me in general of like tourist-heavy economies as well, where, you know, people from America or Britain will go to Jamaica, for example, and they'll be like, oh, you know, I'm giving back to the local economy. And it's like, you're staying at the Hilton.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that.
But we can see where this resentment for the West in Iran goes back, you know, over 100 years, right? Like, we're not talking ancient grievances anymore. We're talking BP.
Yeah.
Let's jump ahead. Like I said, I've been simplifying a lot because the Constitutional Revolution could have its whole episode on its own. A lot of this stuff could, but we're telling the history of Iran here. So let's jump to the Pahlavi era. In 1921, Reza Khan, an army officer from fairly humble background, stages a coup against the Qajars with British support. And by 1925, he crowns himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, a new dynasty in Iran. Now, you might be asking, why did Britain switch sides after they just helped the Qajars shut down the revolution previously? Well, after World War I, the Qajar Shahs were too weak to maintain stability or protect the British oil interests, and a direct British takeover in 1919 failed. With Russia weakened by its own revolution and communism now being a threat to Britain, it shifted its strategy from propping up a weak dynasty to installing a strongman who they could centralize power around. They would use Reza Shah to secure the oil fields, block Soviet influence. Mm-hmm. The model here was after Kemal Ataturk's Turkey, which forced top-down westernization of the country with a mix of Britain's strategy of supporting a visible infrastructure while simultaneously taking away more than the equivalent in resources. I think you've mentioned on the podcast before that over the years, Britain took £1 trillion from India.
Oh, I think it was 45 trillion.
There you go, 45 trillion, but they left some railroads, so
yeah. So it's fine.
It's even, right?
Yeah.
So that's what they were doing here. They were building the Trans-Iranian Railway, they were building factories and secular schools. They ban veils and order men to wear Western hats, and this was nicknamed the Pahlavi hat. This is exactly what happened in Turkey as well. They banned the fez under Ataturk, which was like a symbol of the Ottoman culture. And they crushed tribal autonomy. They forced nomads to settle. The clerics were also sidelined, and religious endowments were seized by the state. Using these funds, they built a modern army and bureaucracy. One thing to note is Iran's relationship with Germany.
Okay.
In the 1930s, Reza Shah cultivates ties with Nazi Germany as a counterweight to Britain and Russia. He is a British puppet, but he still is trying to free himself from that a bit. Trade grows with Germany, and this is partly why Britain and Russia formally invade in 1941. I also want to mention the treatment of minorities, because Reza Shah's nationalism is Persian-centric, just like Ataturk's was Turkish-centric. He suppresses minority languages, Kurdish, Azerbaijani, Arabic, in schools and in public life. And this creates a resentment that lingers for a long time. This is kind of a loaded one, but Adam, throughout modern history, we see centralization projects try to eliminate cultural and linguistic differences that exist between minorities and the central state. The obvious ones people in the West might point fingers at are China, the USSR, Turkey. But lest we forget that these were incredibly brutal yet successful projects in settler colonial states such as the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also amongst older European cultures like what happened in France, Britain, Italy, Scandinavia. So the question is not, is this bad? I think we agree that this is bad.
Yeah.
But why do you think it is? And is there any alternative for a state trying to create a sense of cultural unity?
It's bad because oftentimes when you talk about creating this sort of unitarian sense of identity, that means enforcing a default. And most often the default is whatever ethnic group happens to have power at that time. And it is very hard to get people who don't have that culture, who don't have that relationship, don't have that history. Maybe their own ethnic background has a history of conflict with whatever identity is being sort of pushed upon them. Maybe there's some other reason that it's at odd. That means that then trying to enforce that is often only enforceable through great violence. And even if it's not, there will often, if not always, be hardliners who will insist that these people are too different anyway and need to be sort of exterminated. And that's how a lot of genocides happen. These groups get blamed for various issues, separatist movements, maybe they're not committed to the homeland, etc., etc. Are there ways of encouraging sort of unitarian identity that don't depend on abandoning your identity that you have, your cultural ethnic background? Of course, that have been implemented in different ways and with varying success at various points throughout history. An example that comes to mind is, of course, the Soviet Union. Lots of different ethnic groups in there. Now, of course, there was violence in getting people to conform to the Soviet ideal, but it was in theory...
And there was a Russification of state-centered apparatus.
Absolutely, that did happen. But in theory, things along class lines was this rallying call for identity. And the USSR did fund these kind of anti-colonial movements. Now, was that as a way of putting the middle finger up to the USA and European imperialists? Sure, but the material outcome is still beneficial. Another instance that occurs to me where this has happened is in Switzerland. Switzerland is a country that you don't think of as having a sort of largely diverse ethnic population. But when you talk about culture, when you talk about identity, language is one of the key ways in which this plays out. And there are 4 official languages in Switzerland: German, French, Italian, and Rhaeto-Romansh. And part of the way that is managed is through a democratic system which sees 27 cantons, roughly analogous to states, which have very high degrees of autonomy. It's a federal state. And each of these states have a high degree of independence, so people can still retain a lot of that autonomy, retain a lot of that identity, whilst having this sort of supranational identity. The other thing that I think is key to that in Switzerland and perhaps in Iran as well is a sense of having this shared identity as a defense against outside forces. So in Switzerland, that might have been, you're sort of taught in Switzerland that the emergence of the Helvetic Confederation that became Switzerland, it was basically a group of farmers who met in a field and said, we don't want to be a part of the Holy Roman Empire, and we will stand up for each other so that we don't have to be. That continued post the establishment of modern Swiss borders under Napoleon, under the World Wars. Swiss identity as sort of being a quote-unquote neutral observer.
Let me put you in a scenario where we're looking at like a central state here. Like, let's say you all of a sudden are the chairman, premier of the CCP in China.
Okay, yeah.
And China has done a lot of this over the years. China has done a very good job at unifying under their central cause, though it seems to have come at the expense of the, 20, some dialect of Chinese around China, as well as other languages, separate languages in general that exist in the borders of China, and the culture of that as well. There's a Chinese culture that they push rather than these regional histories, which are very rich. But what would you do instead if you were... Did China have to do this in order to consolidate the power they have? Or was there another way to keep, the Hakka language and Fujian and Cantonese still growing and powerful languages? Or did they have to squash them as they so claimed that it was necessary?
I think that whilst China has times implemented fairly regressive techniques in the name of Chinese unity, often against separatist movements, there is still a persistence of these languages. But these languages do still exist, for sure. And maybe they don't have the same level of visibility or
I know
autonomy.
they exist, but just as someone that lived in Hong Kong and seeing the initiatives there to push Mandarin and push Cantonese out, these will always exist, hopefully. But I think just what I'm talking about is like state policy.
Sure, and I have some thoughts on that, though I do wonder whether that is more of a focus for Hong Kong because it doesn't really want to be a part of China. Pushed more heavily there. What I would do is, I think if it were me, I would do the sort of other side of Chinese policy and focus very heavily on infrastructure, linking up the country in an accessible way through rail as much as possible, high-speed rail, and then creating programs which allow for cultural exchange, particularly of young people. We can run summer camps that allow kids in Harbin to go and do some activities in Chengdu or whatever, or Lhasa or Urumqi or wherever. And I think I would design a history curriculum that highlights those areas of national collaboration, times in the nation's history during which they have these sort of, when these identities overlap more than when they don't. It's probably how I would go about it.
Yeah, it's just a topic. I know it's a side note, but I thought it was worth a little conversation there, because I don't know the answer. I don't know what I would do to preserve, but I do think it is important.
And I think the other thing, you can just make sure and these days, that's because of technology much easier than it would have been in the past, is publishing official documentation in these languages. There has been a big campaign amongst the deaf community in Britain for a while to make British Sign Language an official language of the United Kingdom, and the British government has been very reluctant to do that, largely because they would then be legally required to publish all of their announcements in British Sign Language, as they currently have to in English and Welsh, and that would add a lot of expense.
Yeah. Now let's jump back into the story. Where we left off, 1941, Britain and Russia occupied Iran during World War II. They actually suspect Reza Shah of Nazi sympathies. He'd actually renamed the country to Iran in 1935. And I don't know if you can tell, but the name Iran and Aryan are pretty close. The history of that is longer and more like complicated to explain than that, but the Aryan nation was a highly touted phrase in Nazi Germany. So they forced Reza Shah to abdicate, and they put his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on the throne. This is another case of Britain deciding their political fate. This actually, ironically, opened the door for democratic elements of the monarchy, which it was a parliamentary monarchy, so they did have elections. But it could actually function now because the new Shah was so weak and inexperienced that he actually relied on the parliament to run the country. During the war, Iran becomes a key supply route for U.S. aid to the Soviet Union. It was known as the Persian Corridor. And this brings thousands of American troops and advisors to the region, thus introducing a new foreign power to the mix. At this time, let's check in on the Kurds. With central authority weakened during the war, Kurdish nationalists in the north, with Soviet backing, actually established the Republic of Mahabad, which only lasted for about 10 months in 1946. But this was the first Kurdish state, nation state. It was crushed by Iranian forces after the Soviets withdrew, but it does become the foundation to Kurdish national memory. Now, in 1948, this was a big year for a lot of countries declaring independence from Britain, but a big one was Israel. They declare independence with their new project there. Arab states immediately go to war with them because obviously the creation of Israel was a British project, not backed by the local people of the area. But Iran, they stay out of this conflict. It's the second Muslim majority country after Turkey to recognize Israel. Now, why? Why did they do this? I mean, let's look at the material interests. The Shah sees Israel as a useful counterweight to Arab nationalism, because at the time, Nasser in Egypt, as well as Syria at the time, were starting this pan-Arab project, and this was seen as a big threat to the Shah. B, Israel was also a source of technology and intelligence cooperation. And C, they were a friend to Washington, and the Shah's entire rule depended on the United States at this point. But here's the crucial frame. Israel is a Western proxy. It's not an independent regional power. It's an extension of British and later American influence in the Middle East, and the Shah's alliance with Israel is part of his alliance with the West in general. Meanwhile, Israel develops a periphery doctrine under David Ben-Gurion, and the idea of this is that since Israel is surrounded by hostile Arab states, making allies with non-Arab countries on the periphery, such as Turkey, Iran, Ethiopia, would be vital. Iran is the linchpin of all this because they serve Western interests by creating a bloc of pro-American states in the region. There's also concrete cooperation. Iran supplies Israel with oil. At this time, they build the Eliyat-Ashkelon pipeline carrying Iranian oil to the Mediterranean, bypassing the Suez Canal, and Israeli tankers are flying Iranian flags at this time, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah.
Israel also trains SAVAK, which is the Shah's secret police. They provide military technology and intelligence sharing on Soviet activities and Arab militaries. And then politically, they vote similarly in the UN. They coordinate positions alongside the United States and Britain. And in the 1960s and 70s, Iran is Israel's most important Muslim ally, and therefore a key part of the Western alliance structure of the region. So looking at what this relationship was and where we are now, what do you think this can teach us about periphery nations and the dangers of dealing with proxy states?
Well, I suppose that the danger of dealing with a proxy state is that ultimately the proxy state is dependent on their patron. And if the interests of the patron do not align with the interests of the proxy, then that could cause issues for you. You might find the terms of your agreement changed without your prior agreement. And if you are to push back against that, then that could result in some military action against you.
A bit of I've altered the deal, pray I do not alter it further.
Yes.
1953. This was maybe the pivotal moment in modern Iranian history. Some people will cite 1979, but 1953 might be just as important in hindsight. So in 1951, the Iranian people democratically elect their prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. He becomes very powerful with this young new Shah being so weak, and he nationalizes the oil industry. He's hugely popular. He becomes Times Man of the Year in 1951. But Britain organizes a boycott of Iranian oil, and the economy craters. So MI6 and the CIA begin plotting. In August 1953, the CIA and MI6 orchestrate the overthrow of Mossadegh in Operation Ajax, or Ajax if you're American. The Shah flees briefly, but returns and consolidates absolute power, so that way he can't be undermined by a prime minister again. Thousands are arrested, political opposition's crushed, and the US becomes the new patron and the new target of Iranian resentment. It's no longer just Britain is causing all these issues. It's now the United States. For Iranians, this is the original sin. Everything since the downfall of Mossadegh from 1953 is what is latched in memory. When people chant Death to America, 1953 is ever present in their minds. And one thing to note is that Israel actually plays no direct role in 1953. This is a British-American operation, but Israel benefits by having a pro-Western Iran as an ally. 1960s, the White Revolution is launched by the Shah. This is launched in 1963. This is a whole movement of land reform, women's suffrage, literacy corps, more modernization from above. Now, things like land reform and literacy corps, to me, when I'm reading about it in a general history, I'm thinking back to like Cuba, and this is around the same time they're doing that as well. And to me, it reads, conceding points to the socialists for fear of an uprising, right?
Powerful force throughout history, not to be underestimated, largely responsible for the European welfare state.
Exactly. But unlike in Cuba, where literacy only helped the cause, and unlike Western Europe, where there was less religious fundamentalism, let's say, the clerics in Iran opposed these reforms, seeing it as an attack on their power and tradition in society. One cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, big character going forward, he speaks out and inspires some deadly riots from the holy city of Qom. I say deadly riots in that the protesters were killed by state police. In June 1963, Khomeini is arrested after denouncing the Shah's ties to Israel and America, and massive protests erupt around Tehran and Qom. He's a very popular religious figure, but more regionally at this time. But him getting arrested draws a lot of eyes. Now, at these protests that erupted, thousands were killed. The exact number is disputed, but it's really seared into the revolutionary memory of Iran. Khomeini is exiled in 1964, and he ends up in Najaf, Iraq, but his tapes are smuggled back into Iran, and he becomes a symbol of the resistance against the Shah. Let's check in on the Kurds in the 1960s. There was a Kurdish rebellion. There was a Kurdish rebellion in Iraq, led by Mustafa Barzani, and it gets U.S. and Israeli support. Iran, under the Shah, also supports Iraqi Kurds as a way to pressure Baghdad, but this sets a pattern. Great powers and regional states using the Kurds as pawns, and not just the Soviets this time. Now, the 1970s saw a huge oil boom for Iran. In 1973, oil prices quadruple after the Arab oil embargo, and Iran's revenues explode from $5 billion to $20 billion annually in 1973, so that's a lot of money. The Shah spends massively on arms. He spends billions on American jets. He had the F-14 Tomcats, which was the only country besides the United States to get them. Not even Britain had them, or Israel.
Wow.
Bought tanks, helicopters, and it really becomes the policeman of the Gulf for the U.S. at this time. And the Shah sees himself as the dominant Gulf power, which caused tensions with Saudi Arabia over this oil policy, this regional influence. But both are U.S. allies, so tensions are managed. Look at Greece and Turkey as an example of how this can be handled. Now, minorities continue to be suppressed under the Shah, and the oil-rich Khuzestan, which is the Arab majority, sees little benefit. The Kurdish areas remain poor, and this is sowing seeds for future separatist movements. But despite the Shah, his massive spending, his massive profits, material conditions worsen. Massive inflation destroys living standards. Rent in Tehran is up 300% in 5 years. Corruption is rampant. The royal family skims billions. The Pahlavi Foundation is just a slush fund. Savik, that secret police, tortures and kills dissidents. Tens of thousands of political prisoners. Rapid urbanization uproots millions, creating vast slums on the edge of Tehran. But at the same time, Western culture is flooding in. So miniskirts, bars, casinos, discos. And this offends traditionalists and creates a deep cultural resentment. So by the mid-1970s, Iran looks stable on the surface. In 1971, the Shah throws a lavish party in the ruins of Persepolis, inviting the royalty from around the world to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, and he calls Iran the world's fifth military power alongside US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union.
Wow.
But underneath, everything is boiling. Economic inequality, political repression, cultural resentment, religious anger, minority grievances. And the Shah is dying of cancer. But his physicians lie to him, and they tell him it's a more mild-sounding illness, and he does not make this illness known to the public. In January 1978, a government newspaper published a vicious personal attack on Khomeini. Outraged theology students in Qom protest, troops opened fire, and dozens were killed.
They were protesting in favor of Khomeini.
Yes, they're protesting that the government newspaper had published this attack.
Okay, right.
This starts a cycle because every 40 days, a memorial service becomes a new protest, and each time there's more deaths. Each time the protests grow. By late 1978, Iran is paralyzed. Strikes shut down oil refineries, which is the lifeblood of the economy. Millions march, chanting death to the Shah, independence, freedom, Islamic Republic. In January 16, 1979, the Shah and the Empress flee. He flies to the first of his many exiled locations in Egypt, and the crowds in Tehran tear his statues down. Now, these are not just Islamists. It was a coalition. There were leftists, the Tuda Party, and Maoists. There were nationalists of the liberal ilk. There were Mossadegh supporters. There were bazaar merchants. There were students. There were clerics. But they were all united against the Shah. But with all different goals now that the Shah was no longer in the picture, and not everyone can win. The one man who initially sparked these protests is returning from his exile, even more powerful than when he left. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini would land in Tehran to a crowd of 5 million people, and he will literally shape the revolution in his image. But we'll find out how, and also how we led up to the present war, in our next episode. So Adam, any closing thoughts?
It seems like Iran is a place that's been both blessed and cursed by its geography. Its geography has made it, in some senses, rich, that it's resource heavy. It's not rich, the richest countries in the world, but it does have certain resources which are valuable. But it has also made it a target for powerful players throughout the world in all of history. But at the same time, that has allowed maybe it to defend itself, as it is doing currently through its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. It seems like a bit of an enigma, a country that is it's got a lot of very complicated history, a lot of overlapping interests trying to shape the place in a way that we are still seeing play out today.
Very well put. We'll see how it plays out later on, and I'm looking forward to that discussion as well. But as always, dear listener, thank you for loaning us your time. If you enjoyed this episode, we would be so grateful if you could share it with a friend, or subscribe, or give us 5 stars or a like wherever you're listening from. And as always, look out for each other and keep fighting the good fight. Adam, to close out, can you please read this quote from Esmail Hoy, a prominent Iranian poet who initially supported the revolution, but later spent his life criticizing the regime from exile? And this is from an interview he gave to the BBC in 1999, as he recounts what it felt like to be in the crowd of millions awaiting Khomeini's return.
The day was a great day of hopes and dreams, the day of our greatest dreams. And it will remain a great day, even though our dream was soon to turn into a great nightmare.